Graduated 4 years ago. Studying was fine, no real complaints about the experience itself. It had its rhythms, its predictable stretches of stress and release, its late nights that felt momentous at the time and now blurred together into something softer. There were lectures that drifted past without much impact, and others that stayed lodged in the mind for reasons that are hard to fully explain. Some tutors were brilliant in ways that felt almost accidental, like they had wandered into the role and discovered they were good at it. Others were less so, but even that seemed part of the overall texture rather than a defining flaw. I learned things, I forgot things. I passed exams, I met people. It was, in most ways, exactly what it said it would be. Then last month, an email arrived from the alumni relations team with the subject line, "Give back to the place that shaped you." It appeared in the middle of an otherwise ordinary morning, tucked between a receipt for something I didn't remember buying and a newsletter I never quite get around to unsubscribing from. The timing felt almost poetic in the way automated systems sometimes accidentally achieve. 4 years is apparently the right amount of time for nostalgia to begin setting in, for the rough edges of the experience to smooth themselves out just enough that the idea of a giving back can be presented without irony. It had a photo of the campus in autumn light, very tasteful, the kind of image that suggests permanence and calm in a sort of quiet intellectual dignity. The trees were in that precise stage of turning where every leaf looks deliberate, like it had been placed there by a careful hand rather than the slow work of seasons. The buildings looked older than they are, or perhaps just more meaningful than they felt when walking past them on a Tuesday morning thinking about deadlines. It was an image designed to remind me of something, or perhaps to gently suggest that I had once belonged to something worth remembering. The email explained that donations help fund student bursaries, campus improvements, and research initiatives. It was written in that tone that manages to be both friendly and institutional at the same time, like a voice that has been carefully adjusted until it offends no one and inspires just enough warmth to prompt action. There were small details included to make the impact feel tangible. A bursary could change a student's life. A new facility could enhance learning. Research could shape the future. All of it presented in a way that made the act of donating seem not just reasonable, but quietly meaningful, like participating in a continuation of something larger than yourself. At the bottom were 3 suggested donation amounts with little radio buttons. £25, £50, £100. The neatness of it stood out. The options were modest enough to feel accessible, but structured enough to imply a certain expectation. Not so large as to alarm, not so small as to feel insignificant. Each one sitting there as if waiting for a simple, painless decision, a small gesture, framed as both generous and entirely manageable. I sat with it for a minute, not in any dramatic sense, just long enough to let the idea settle. There is a particular kind of pause that happens in moments like that, where the practical and the symbolic quietly overlap. On one level, it is just an email asking for money. On another, it is an invitation to reinterpret a past experience in a specific way, to see it as something that shaped you and therefore deserves recognition in return. Then I replied. I thanked them for reaching out and said, I would love to give back to the institution that shaped me. The phrasing came easily, almost as if I were responding in the same tone the message had been written in. There is something slightly surreal about mirroring that language, about stepping into the rhythm of it, and this bit while also holding a different reality. And I explained that my current student loan balance stood at £34,200 and was accumulating interest at a rate I won't bore them with here, but is available on the Student Loans Company website if they're curious. It felt important to include that detail, not in a confrontational way, but simply as context. Gebrüchi? The number itself carries a kind of quiet weight. It is not abstract in the way the suggested donations are abstract. It is specific, precise, and ongoing. It exists in the background of daily life, not always at the forefront, but never entirely absent either. The interest accumulates whether I think about it or not, a steady, almost invisible process that turns time into something measurable in a very particular way. I said that once this figure reaches 0, I would be genuinely delighted to consider a contribution, and that I hoped the campus improvements could wait until then. There was a slight humor in that line, though it wasn't intended to be sharp. Or a gentle acknowledgement of the mismatch between the request and the circumstances. The idea that the institution could pause its ambitions until one former student resolves a personal financial obligation is obviously unrealistic. But that is part of what makes the statement feel quietly pointed. I kept the tone warm and sincere throughout. I meant every word of it. There was no intention to dismiss or mock the request. The idea of supporting students, improving facilities, funding research, all of that is genuinely worthwhile. The dissonance lies not in the goals themselves, but in the context in which the request is made. It is difficult to separate the concept of giving back from the reality of still paying for the experience being referenced. I received an automated acknowledgement email saying my message had been received and a team member would be in touch. It arrived almost instantly, as these things tend to. Polite, efficient, entirely noncommittal. It thanked me for engaging and assured me that my response was valued. There is a certain uniformity to these messages that makes them feel less like communication and more like confirmation that a system is functioning as intended. That was 6 weeks ago. No team member has been in touch. The absence of a follow-up feels almost more telling than any reply could have been. It creates a small, quiet gap where a conversation might have existed. Not that I expected a detailed response, but there is something notable about the silence. Suggests that my reply did not fit neatly into whatever categories the system is designed to handle. I find this quite funny, actually. Not in a way that is loud or dramatic, but in the sense of recognizing a situation that contains a subtle, almost accidental absurdity. The idea of an alumni relations process encountering an answer it cannot easily process has a certain understated humor to it. It is not a failure exactly, just a moment where the expected script does not quite apply. I assume the reply went to someone whose entire job is managing cheerful donor relationships, and this email arrived like a small personal weather event. I imagine them opening it in the middle of a routine sequence of interactions, expecting a variation of the usual responses, and instead finding something slightly off pattern. Not hostile, not even particularly unusual in substance, but framed in a way that resists the usual pathways of response. And there is a particular skill involved in maintaining that kind of role, in keeping conversations positive and forward-moving, in guiding people gently toward a decision that aligns with the institution's goals. It requires a certain consistency of tone, a kind of practiced optimism. An email like mine does not directly oppose that, but it does introduce a different kind of reality into the exchange, one that does not easily convert into a donation or a polite decline. I hope they're okay. It is a sincere thought, though perhaps slightly unnecessary. There is no real reason to assume the email had any significant impact beyond a brief moment of consideration before being set aside. Still, it is easy to imagine the human element behind these processes, the individuals who interact with messages that range from enthusiastic to indifferent to quietly resistant. I hold no ill will. There is nothing in the exchange that warrants it. The email was polite, the request reasonable within its own framework, the lack of response entirely understandable. If anything, the situation feels more like an illustration than a conflict, a small example of how different perspectives can coexist without fully aligning. I just also hold 34,200 pounds of debt. It sits there as a simple, factual counterpoint to the idea of giving back, a reminder that the relationship with the institution did not conclude at graduation. It continues in a quieter, less visible form, one that does not appear in autumn photographs or carefully worded emails. It is not dramatic or overwhelming on a daily basis, but it is persistent, a steady presence that shapes decisions in subtle ways. There is something interesting about how time interacts with all of this. 4 years is long enough for certain memories to soften, for the experience to be reframed in a more positive light, but not long enough for the financial aspect to disappear. The two timelines move at different speeds. Nostalgia accelerates, debt lingers. The email exists at the intersection of those two processes, drawing on one while overlooking the other. It makes me wonder how many similar responses exist. How many people read that message and feel the same small moment of pause? the same awareness of an unfinished transaction. Not necessarily with frustration or resentment, but with a kind of quiet recognition that the story being told does not fully match their current reality. And how many of those responses are never written, replaced instead with a quick archive or delete? The moment passing without comment. There is also something about the structure of the request itself, the way it simplifies the act of giving into three neat options: 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. It presents generosity as something that can be selected with a click, a decision made in seconds. And for some people at some point, that is probably true. The friction is minimal, the impact feels manageable. But for others, the calculation is different. Not because the amounts are unreasonable, but because they exist alongside other, larger figures that are harder to ignore. The radio buttons remain unselected, the email now sitting somewhere in an archive folder, preserved more as a curiosity than a call to action. It is a small moment, easily overlooked, but it carries a certain clarity when examined closely. Not a critique, not a complaint, just an observation of how systems interact with individual circumstances in ways that are sometimes slightly out of sync a few days after that exchange or lack of one. I found myself thinking about how often institutions continue speaking in a tone that assumes a shared narrative long after the individual experience has diverged from it. There is a kind of confidence in those messages, a steady belief that the story they are telling still fits. It's not aggressive or even particularly forceful, just persistent in a way that suggests it rarely encounters resistance that requires adjustment. The language remains polished, the imagery consistent, the invitation always framed as something natural and mutually understood. It made me notice similar patterns elsewhere, in smaller and less obvious ways. The way services send reminders that feel less like information and more like gentle nudges toward a behavior they've already decided makes sense. The way phrases like a join us, a be part of, and a continue your journey appear in contexts where the journey, at least from one side, feels distinctly paused or redirected. There's an assumption embedded in all of it that alignment still exists, that the relationship continues in roughly the same shape it had before, just translated into a new phase. But relationships don't always translate cleanly like that. Sometimes they fragment into separate threads, each carrying a different version of what came before. The institution moves forward with its narrative intact, refined, and reinforced through repetition. The individual moves forward with a more uneven collection of impressions, practical realities, and shifting priorities. Both are valid in their own ways, but they don't always overlap in the way those emails seem to expect. There's also something about the timing of these messages that feels carefully calibrated, but not necessarily accurate on a personal level. 4 years is a neat number. It suggests enough distance for perspective, enough time for early career stability, enough space for gratitude to emerge without being overshadowed by immediate concerns. It's a reasonable estimate, statistically speaking, but lived experience doesn't always follow those timelines. 4 years can be a period of consolidation or uncertainty or quiet adjustment. It can be a time when things are still very much in progress rather than settled. The email doesn't account for that variation, and it doesn't need to, really. It operates on averages, on probabilities, on the idea that most people will be somewhere within a certain range of readiness to engage. But being on the edges of that range, even slightly, creates a subtle disconnect. The message arrives as if it already knows something about your situation. And when that assumption doesn't quite hold, it becomes noticeable in a way that's difficult to articulate but easy to feel. I started to think about what it would look like if the communication acknowledged that gap more openly. Not in a heavy or overly detailed way, just a small recognition that people's circumstances differ, that a giving back can take different forms or happen at different times, or not happen at all without diminishing the value of what came before. Even a slight shift in tone could change the way the message lands, making it feel less like a continuation of a script and more like an invitation that allows for variation. At the same time, I understand why the script exists. It works, or at least it works often enough to justify its consistency. There is comfort in familiarity, in knowing what to say and how to say it, in relying on a structure that has been refined over time. Changing that would introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is not something systems tend to embrace easily. It's simpler to keep the message stable and accept that it won't resonate equally with everyone. There's a kind of quiet efficiency in that approach, but also a certain loss of nuance. Individual experiences become slightly flattened, fitted into a general framework that captures the broad strokes, but misses the smaller, more specific details. Those details are where the interesting parts often are, the parts that don't translate neatly into standard categories or predictable responses. I found myself revisiting my own time there, not in a nostalgic way exactly, but with a more analytical perspective. What did it actually shape in concrete terms? What elements of that experience still have a clear presence in my current life, and which ones have faded into something more abstract? The answers weren't entirely straightforward. Some influences are obvious, tied to specific skills or knowledge areas. Others are more diffuse, embedded in habits of thinking or ways of approaching problems. And then there are aspects that feel less like shaping and more like passing through, moments that were significant at the time, but didn't leave a lasting imprint. It's a mixed picture, as most things are. The financial timeline continues independently, extending the practical implications of that experience into the present in a way that isn't as easily reframed. It's interesting how rarely that aspect is acknowledged in these kinds of communication, not because it's hidden or unknown, but because it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative being presented. The focus remains on the positive, on the opportunities created, on the shared sense of belonging. And again, none of that is inaccurate. It's just selective, emphasizing certain elements while leaving others implied or unspoken. The result is a message that feels complete on its own terms, but slightly incomplete when viewed from a different perspective. Not wrong, just partial. And that partiality becomes more noticeable the more you think about it, the more you consider the full context in which the request is being made. I started to notice how this pattern extends beyond just this one type of email. There are similar dynamics in other areas where systems interact with individuals based on generalized assumptions that hold true often enough, but not universally. So the language remains consistent, the expectations stable, even as the actual circumstances vary widely. It's an efficient way of operating, but it inevitably creates moments where the fit isn't quite right. Those moments are usually small, easy to overlook. They don't cause major disruptions or require immediate attention, but they accumulate in subtle ways, shaping how these interactions are perceived over time. A slight misalignment here, a misnuance there, each one contributing to a broader sense of distance between the message being sent and the experience being lived. At the same time, it's difficult to imagine a system that could fully account for all those variations without becoming overly complex or losing its clarity. Simplicity is part of what makes these communications effective. The message is easy to understand, the action straightforward, the outcome clear. Introducing too much nuance could dilute that clarity, making the request less direct and potentially less successful. So there's a kind of balance being maintained, whether consciously or not. On one side, the need for consistency and efficiency. On the other, the reality of individual experiences that don't always align perfectly with the general framework. The email sits somewhere in the middle of that balance, leaning toward simplicity, but inevitably brushing up against complexity in certain cases. What makes it interesting is not that this happens, but how it's experienced when it does. The response isn't usually strong enough to be called frustration or disagreement. It's more of a quiet recognition, a moment of noticing that something doesn't quite match up. And that recognition can go in different directions. Sometimes it leads to disengagement, a simple decision to ignore the message and move on. Other times it leads to a response, an attempt to articulate the mismatch in a way that remains polite but honest. That act of articulation is a small but meaningful shift. It introduces a different kind of information into the interaction, one that isn't captured by the standard options. It says, in effect, this is what the situation looks like from here, not as a challenge or a rejection, but as an addition to the conversation that wasn't originally anticipated. Whether or not that addition is processed in any meaningful way is another question. Systems are designed to handle certain types of input more easily than others. A clear yes or no fits neatly into the expected flow. A more nuanced response requires a different kind of engagement, one that may not always be prioritized or even possible within the existing structure. That doesn't make the response pointless, though. It still exists as a record of a perspective, a small piece of feedback that reflects a specific reality. Even if it doesn't lead to an immediate change or a direct reply, it contributes to a broader understanding of how these messages are received across different contexts. There's also something about the tone of these exchanges that stands out. The emphasis on warmth, on sincerity, on maintaining a positive atmosphere even when the content becomes slightly more complex. It's a kind of conversational etiquette that keeps things smooth, avoids confrontation, and allows for differences to be expressed without escalating into conflict. That tone is part of what makes the original email effective, but it also shapes how responses are framed. Matching that tone becomes almost instinctive, even when introducing elements that complicate the message. It creates a kind of shared language that both sides operate within, even if the underlying perspectives differ. And within that shared language, there's room for subtle humor, for small acknowledgments of the situation that don't disrupt the overall flow, but add a layer of awareness. Lines like "hoping the campus improvements can wait" carry that kind of tone, balancing sincerity with a gentle recognition of the mismatch. It's not about undermining the request, just about placing it in a slightly different context. That context is what ultimately defines how the interaction is experienced. The same message can feel entirely reasonable in one situation and slightly out of place in another, depending on the surrounding circumstances. The content doesn't change, but the way it lands does. Over time, these small variations in how messages are received and responded to create a more complex picture of the relationship between individuals and institutions. It's not a single unified narrative, but a collection of overlapping experiences, each one shaped by specific factors that aren't always visible from the outside. And within that collection, there are moments like this one, where the interaction becomes just as distinct enough to notice. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because the usual patterns shift slightly, revealing the structure underneath in a way that's easy to miss when everything aligns as expected. There's a point where the repetition of these kinds of messages starts to create its own background noise. A low-level familiarity that makes each new version feel both slightly different and entirely predictable at the same time. You begin to recognize the structure before you even finish reading it, the cadence of the sentences, the way certain phrases appear almost unchanged from one communication to the next. It becomes less about the specific content of any single email and more about the pattern they collectively form over time. That pattern carries a kind of quiet persistence. It doesn't demand attention in an urgent way, but it doesn't fully recede either. It sits there, occasionally resurfacing, gently reminding you of a connection that is assumed to still be active. The tone remains consistent, always measured, always positive, always suggesting that engagement is both welcome and expected, even if it's not explicitly stated in those terms. Over time, this consistency starts to shape how the messages are received. The first one might prompt a pause, a moment of consideration, a brief engagement with the idea being presented. By the third or fourth, the response becomes more automatic, less reflective. Not dismissive exactly, but streamlined. You recognize what is being asked before it is fully articulated, and your reaction forms alongside that recognition rather than after it. There's something interesting about how that shift happens. It's not a conscious decision to disengage, more a gradual adjustment to a familiar stimulus. The novelty fades, replaced by a kind of quiet efficiency in processing the message. You know where it's going, you know what it's asking, and you know more or less how you feel about it. The space for reflection narrows, not because it's unnecessary, but because it feels already resolved. And yet, every now and then, something interrupts that pattern. Not dramatically, just enough to bring the message back into focus. It might be a slight change in wording, a different emphasis, or simply a moment where your own circumstances have shifted just enough to make the content land differently. The same request, seen from a slightly altered position, can feel new again, or at least newly noticeable. Those moments are where the interaction becomes more than routine. They create a small opening where the automatic response pauses and something more deliberate takes its place. It doesn't always lead to action, but it does reintroduce the possibility of engagement in a way that the more familiar versions of the message no longer do. At the same time, the predictability of the structure makes those interruptions stand out more clearly. Because the baseline is so consistent, even a minor variation becomes noticeable. It's like hearing a familiar piece of music and catching a note that's slightly out of place, not enough to disrupt the whole, but enough to draw attention to itself. In this case, the interruption wasn't in the email itself, but in the response it prompted. Taking the time to reply, to step outside the usual pattern of either ignoring or briefly acknowledging, created a different kind of interaction. It shifted the dynamic from passive reception to active participation, even if only for a moment. That shift changes how the entire exchange is perceived. It introduces a sense of agency that isn't present when the message is simply absorbed and set aside. It also highlights the asymmetry in the interaction. The institution communicates at scale, sending out messages designed to reach many people at once. The individual responds from a single specific context, bringing details that don't necessarily translate back into that broader framework. That asymmetry is usually invisible, or at least easy to ignore. The system is designed to smooth it over, to create the impression of a continuous, coherent dialogue even when the underlying processes are quite different. But moments like this make it more apparent. They reveal the difference between a message designed for general applicability and a response rooted in particular circumstances. There's also something about the idea of timing that becomes more complex the more you think about it. Not just the timing of when the email is sent, but the timing of when it is received in relation to everything else happening in a person's life. The same message can arrive at two different moments and be experienced in entirely different ways, depending on what else is going on. In one scenario, it might feel like a reasonable prompt, arriving at a time when things are stable enough to consider it without much friction. In another, it might feel slightly disconnected, appearing in the middle of other priorities that make the request seem less relevant or more difficult to engage with. The message itself doesn't change, but the context around it does, and that context plays a significant role in how it is interpreted. This variability is something the system can't fully account for and doesn't really try to. It operates on schedules and cycles, on the idea that reaching out at certain intervals will capture enough alignment to make the effort worthwhile. And statistically, that's probably true. But on an individual level, it creates a series of interactions that don't always land with the intended effect. What's interesting is how those interactions accumulate over time. Each one is small, easily dismissed on its own, but together they form a kind of ongoing conversation, even if it's not experienced as such in the moment. They build a picture of how the institution sees the relationship, how it chooses to maintain it, how it frames the idea of continued connection. At the same time, the individual side of that conversation is less structured, more intermittent. It's shaped by moments of attention, rather than a consistent narrative. Sometimes the connection feels present and meaningful, other times it fades into the background, only to be briefly reactivated by something like an email or a memory triggered by an unrelated event. That difference in structure means the two sides are not always fully in sync. The institution speaks regularly, predictably. The individual listens occasionally, selectively. The result is a dialogue that exists, but not always in a balanced or continuous way. It's more like overlapping signals that sometimes align and sometimes pass by each other without fully connecting. And within that, there's a kind of quiet negotiation happening. Not explicit, not even necessarily conscious, but present in the way each message is received and each response is formed or not formed. It's about what the connection means at this point, what it's worth, how it fits into everything else that's going on. For some people, that negotiation resolves easily. The connection remains strong. The requests feel reasonable. The responses follow naturally. For others, it becomes more ambiguous, less clearly defined. The connection exists, but its relevance shifts. Its importance fluctuates, its expression becomes less straightforward. The email, in its simplicity, doesn't reflect that ambiguity. It presents a clear, direct pathway from connection to action, but the reality on the receiving end can be more complex, involving considerations that extend beyond the scope of the message itself. Financial situations, personal priorities, changing perspectives, all of these factors play a role in shaping the response, even if they're not visible within the interaction. That gap between simplicity and complexity is where most of the interesting dynamics exist. It's where the clean lines of the message meet the uneven contours of real experience. And it's not a problem to be solved, just a characteristic of how these systems function when they intersect with individual lives. There's also something to be said for the way humor emerges in these situations, not as a reaction to anything particularly dramatic, but as a way of acknowledging the slight misalignment without giving it too much weight. It's a subtle kind of humor, more about recognition than amusement, about seeing the shape of the interaction and noticing where it doesn't quite fit. That kind of response feels appropriate here because the stakes are relatively low. There's no significant consequence to not donating, no pressure beyond the gentle suggestion embedded in the message. The interaction remains light, even when examined more closely. It allows for a certain level of detachment, a willingness to observe rather than react strongly. And in that observation, the details become more apparent. The structure of the message, the assumptions it carries, the way it fits into a broader pattern of communication. None of it is particularly unusual on its own, but together it forms a small, self-contained example of how institutions and individuals continue to interact long after the formal relationship has ended. It's not about whether the email should have been sent or whether the response should have been different. It's more about what the interaction reveals when you take the time to look at it from a slight distance, to notice the elements that usually pass without comment, to consider how something so routine can still contain moments of quiet complexity eventually. What stands out most is not the content of any single message, but the way it settles into memory alongside everything else that came before and after it. Not prominently, not as something that demands attention, but as a small, defined moment that can be returned to and examined from different angles. It becomes less about the request itself and more about what it represents within a longer sequence of interactions, a kind of marker that highlights how certain relationships continue to exist in subtle, often indirect ways. Memory has a way of reshaping these moments, smoothing some details while sharpening others. The exact wording of the email fades fairly quickly, replaced by a general impression of tone and intent. The image of the campus in autumn light lingers a little longer, not because it was particularly striking, but because it fits so neatly into a familiar visual language. The reply, though, remains more clearly defined, perhaps because it required a deliberate act of composition, a moment of translating a set of thoughts into something structured and shareable. That act of writing creates its own kind of imprint. It turns a passing reaction into something more concrete, something that can be revisited and reconsidered, even without a response, or perhaps because of the absence of one. It becomes a self-contained exchange, a loop that closes on itself rather than extending outward. There's a certain completeness to that, even if it's not the kind of completion the original message was aiming for. Over time, the significance of the moment doesn't necessarily increase, but it becomes more accessible as a point of reference. It's the kind of example that can be drawn on when thinking about similar situations, not as a definitive case, but as one instance among many that illustrate a broader pattern. It provides a way of grounding abstract ideas in something specific, something that actually happened, even if on a relatively small scale. And within that, there's a gradual shift in perspective that happens almost without noticing. What initially feels like a single interaction starts to connect with other, seemingly unrelated experiences. Different emails, different requests, different contexts, all sharing a similar structure or tone. The patterns become more visible, not because they change, but because attention to them increases. That increased awareness doesn't necessarily lead to a change in behavior, at least not in any immediate or dramatic way. It's more subtle than that, more about how things are perceived than how they are acted upon. The messages still arrive, The structures remain the same, but the way they are processed includes an additional layer of recognition. You see not just the content, but the framework behind it, the assumptions it carries, the purpose it serves. There's a kind of quiet detachment that comes with that recognition. Not disengagement exactly, but a slight step back that allows for observation without full immersion. The message is still reads, still understood, but it's also seen as part of a larger system, one that operates according to its own logic and priorities. That perspective doesn't diminish the message, but it does change its weight, its immediacy. At the same time, that detachment coexists with moments of unexpected connection. A phrase that resonates, a memory that surfaces, a brief sense of alignment that cuts through the general pattern. These moments are less predictable, less structured, but they carry a different kind of significance. They remind you that the relationship, however distant or abstract it may have become, still has points of contact that feel real and immediate. Those points of contact are often tied to very specific details, things that wouldn't necessarily appear in a generalized message. A particular lecture, a conversation, a place on campus that held some personal meaning. They exist outside the formal narrative, but they influence how that narrative is received. They add texture to the experience, making it more than just a sequence of standardized interactions. The email, in its attempt to evoke a shared sense of experience, touches on that territory without fully accessing it. It gestures toward memory, toward connection, but it does so in a way that remains broadly applicable rather than deeply specific. That's part of its strength in terms of reaching a wide audience, but also part of its limitation when it comes to individual resonance. What's interesting is how those limitations don't necessarily reduce the effectiveness of the message in a general sense. They just create a range of responses, some of which align closely with the intended outcome, and others that diverge in quieter, less visible ways. The system doesn't need every interaction to succeed in the same way for it to function overall. It relies on enough alignment across enough instances to maintain its momentum. From the individual perspective, though, each interaction stands on its own, shaped by a specific set of circumstances that aren't averaged out or generalized. That's where the difference lies. The system sees patterns and aggregates, the individual experiences, moments, and details. Both are valid, but they operate at different levels of resolution. This difference becomes more apparent the more you think about how these interactions are designed. The language, the timing, the structure, all carefully considered to produce a certain effect across a broad audience. There's a kind of precision to it, even if it doesn't always feel that way on the receiving end. It's the result of iteration, of testing what works and refining it over time. And yet, for all that precision, there's an inherent unpredictability in how any given message will be received by a particular person at a particular moment. That unpredictability isn't a flaw, just a characteristic of dealing with human experience. It means that even the most carefully crafted communication will encounter variations in interpretation, in response, in overall impact. Those variations are where the more interesting aspects of these interactions tend to emerge. Not in the straightforward cases where everything aligns as expected, but in the edges, the slight deviations, the moments where the message and the context don't quite match up. They reveal something about both sides of the exchange, about the assumptions built into the message and the realities shaping the response. In this case, the absence of a follow-up becomes part of that variation. It adds a small, quiet dimension to the interaction, a space where something could have happened but didn't. That space invites a certain amount of interpretation, not because it needs to be explained, but because it stands out just enough to be noticed. It's easy to imagine different outcomes. A brief, polite reply acknowledging the situation, a more detailed response offering alternative ways to stay engaged, or even a standardized message that fits the reply into an existing category and continues the interaction along a predefined path. None of those happened, and that absence becomes its own kind of outcome. There's something about that non-response that reinforces the sense of the system operating according to its own parameters, not ignoring the input, but not fully engaging with it either. It acknowledges receipt, then returns to its usual flow. The individual response, with all its specific context, doesn't quite alter the trajectory of the broader process. That doesn't make the response irrelevant, though. It still exists as part of the interaction, even if its impact is limited. Not as limited. It still represents a moment where the general met the specific, where a standardized request encountered a particular reality. And even if that encounter didn't lead to a visible change, it contributes to the overall landscape of how these interactions unfold. Over time, these small moments accumulate, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that subtly shapes understanding. They create a more nuanced view of how systems and individuals relate to each other, how communication functions across different levels, how meaning is constructed and interpreted in contexts that are both shared and distinct. It becomes less about any single email, any single response, and more about the patterns that connect them, the variations that differentiate them, the ways in which they reflect broader dynamics without ever fully capturing them. And within that, there's a kind of quiet clarity that emerges not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing awareness of how these interactions take place, how they are experienced, and how they continue to evolve in small, often unnoticed ways.